Hello and welcome to the 11th Jerusalem Writers Festival in Mishkenot She'ananim. My name is Julia Purmento-Czajzler. I'm the artistic director of the festival, and it is my great pleasure to talk today with one of the finest writers of our time, Mרגרט Atwood, a poet, novelist, story writer, essayist, and environmental activist. The Handmaid's Tale, a TV series based on the 1985 novel of the same name, was released in perfect timing with the rise of Donald Trump to power, and overnight, the image of women dressed in red robes became a symbol of a fight for women's rights. And Mרגרט Atwood became a sort of apocalyptic prophet because she was able to predict the day when the extreme right would gain power and will control women's life. Hello, Mרגרט.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Taking into account the complicated political context.
Extremely complicated and kind of stupid, really.
Unbelievably stupid. And I think that's what makes it even more unfortunate.
Yes. So what's your first question?
My first question is, you're considered by many to be a prophetic on all important, crucial issues we are to be dealing with today. As far as the themes in your writing, you're sort of an oracle. Ezra Klein wrote that a very good rule of thumb is that whatever Mרגרט Atwood is worried about, that's what the rest of us are going to be worrying about a decade from now and more. So how do you explain the immediacy of your writing? How do you feel about it?
Well, it becomes immediate when circumstances change. So we had The Handmaid's Tale in 1985 as a response to the pushback that was happening from 1980 against changes that had happened in the 1970s, in particular with regards to women's rights. But let us say here that women are people. It's a radical view, I know, but anything that affects their rights is going to affect all of the other people too. So it's not just women. Women do not exist in a little closed room over there somewhere. They are part of society. Society would not exist without them. And everybody in history has always had some views on the control, especially of young women, because unless young women have babies, there is not going to be any society later on. That's just a fact, unless we come up with some advanced cloning or AI people out of bottles or something like that. If we don't have those, it's going to be women. And that's why everybody is always fighting over what they should do, shouldn't do, must do, don't have to do. And you can trace this all the way back. And as you know, in The Handmaid's Tale, I put nothing in that someone somewhere hadn't done. So it's not prophecy. It's looking at human behavior. And in the case of The Handmaid's Tale, what the people on the extreme right would do, because they were saying that's what they would do if they came to power. So I never ignore this kind of talk from anywhere. I think that if people say they're going to do something, they probably will, particularly if it's something bad. Something good, maybe that's a bit harder, but something bad, they will really try to attempt it. So you and your situation right now, what is it that the people trying to seize total power, because that's what it is. If you control the judiciary and it's just a rubber stamp for the government, you might as well be in Stalinist 1930s. So what is it that they are saying that they will do if they get this power? Because they'll probably do it.
And when you see the women's protest in Tel Aviv, in which hundreds of women use your character to protest women's rights, how does it make you feel? Does it make you happy?
Well, I've never seen so many, I have to say. I've seen lots of protests, but the way they were organized, and so, I mean, it could have been a shot right out of the
Right.
television series. It was very choreographed and visual. So the reason this outfit has become a symbol is that we live in an age of television and visual images and striking visual images. So if we were still in the age of radio, this would not be happening.
Right.
Because nobody could see it. The first people to do it were some women in Texas who wanted to go into the Texas legislature, where a lot of men in dark suits were making laws about something they seemed to know very little about, namely women's bodies. The extent to which the men making these laws are misinformed or just ignorant is really astonishing. So they haven't even done the basic biology. They don't even know what an ectopic pregnancy is. They don't seem to know any of these things. Because they're not discussed at the dinner table in general. So unless they make a point of studying it, they don't know, and they don't want to study that. They just want to control people. So the Texas women were going to go into the legislature in this outfit, and they ordered some, but when they arrived, they were pink. And this is what they had in mind. So they very quickly sewed some that were red, went into the legislature, couldn't be kicked out because they weren't creating a disturbance, and couldn't be ejected because they were immodestly dressed. They were not immodestly dressed. They were very covered up. So there they were, and television cameras immediately go there because they're very striking. So this caught on all over the world. We've seen it in Argentina. We've seen it in Ireland. We've seen it in numerous countries where there is still enough freedom that you don't automatically just get shot for doing it. And therefore you are seeing it in Israel right now, because it is a protest against a proposed totalitarian takeover of a democracy. Let's not call it anything else.
Absolutely. I'm curious if, from your position as an author, do you intentionally write in order to evoke the desire to protest in your readers? Did you ever imagine that your writing would become such a distinct symbol?
No. No, first of all, I'm not a prophet. And judging from the hard times that prophets usually got, most notably in the Bible, in the Torah, prophets were always getting into trouble. Why? Because they were going to people in authority, such as kings. So they're always getting into trouble. So in that sense, sure, I get into trouble, but since Canada is not a totalitarianism, I don't get into major trouble. I don't have to go hide in a cave, right? So one of the functions of prophets in olden times was to do that, to say, you know, you're the king, but I'm here to tell you what you're doing is wrong. And I play that role in a theater, an online theater called Theater of War. I play Tiresias in Antigone. And the Tiresias figure is, of course, a prophet. And he turns up and says to Creon, what you're doing is wrong. So insofar as one says, what you're doing is wrong, and that is what those women are saying in their outfits. They're saying, what you are doing is wrong. That's one of the functions of prophecy. The prophets weren't usually thought of as being infallibly able to predict the future. They were prophesying from the point of view of the present, fairly close present. In other words, if you do that today, the result tomorrow, not down the line 100 years from now, the result tomorrow is not going to be what you would like. It's what they say. So yes, in that sense, yes, but in the sense of knowing what's going to happen, no, I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does, because there isn't just the future. you can make a guess. You can say, if you do this, the likely result is going to be that. But you can't say this will happen.
Mhm.
For one thing, the trajectory has already been altered. The trajectory of what people doing this thought might be the future, that's already been altered by the protests.
Mhm.
So the people in power, the creon amongst you, the king, he is going to have to take into account the fact that an awful lot of people in the country think what he is doing is wrong.
It's interesting. And why do you think that we as readers are, on the other hand, are so drawn to dystopias?
Right now.
Why humans so intently for the end of the world?
Okay. So this wasn't a trend earlier in the 21st century or in the latter part of the 20th century. So the utopias and dystopias are like this. They're a yin-yang structure. So utopia is the world people think they might like, and dystopia is the world they think they might not like. But as I've written in my little book on sci-fi and speculative fiction, every utopia has within it a little dystopia, usually the world as it was before the utopia. And every dystopia has a little utopia. Some of the characters in the dystopia hope for a better world, and sometimes they escape to it. So the 19th century was a century of utopias. A lot of literary ones, a lot of people tried to have real ones. And that didn't start in the 19th century. So the American 17th century Puritans thought they were going to build a utopia. And there have been a lot of plans like this. Most of them have come to grief. In fact, they have all eventually come to grief. And then we had some big experiments in the 20th century, and that would include the Soviet Union. It would include, in some senses, Nazi Germany. Things are going to be just so much better. Just do what I say and get rid of those people. There's always those people. Maoist China, including the Cultural Revolution part, we got to get rid of those people. And a bunch of smaller ones, let's say Pol Pot in Cambodia, etc. Sometimes they're just reactive. So the Argentinian generals we're doing this to save you from those other bad people that we are going to throw into the ocean, which they then did. So it became less and less possible to write utopias in the 20th century because people didn't believe in them anymore. And we had seen such horrific wars and atrocities and massacres that it was just not, it was not something that people could invest belief in. But now I think we are seeing some more positive thinking. That is, we can reverse totalitarianisms. We've seen it happen. And we also can do quite a lot to improve the thing that is scaring many, namely the situation of the planet. There's a lot of people working very hard on that, and they're making new materials, they're making new technologies and new processes, and that is already having an effect. So positive thinking is needed if people are actually going to do anything, and protests are a form of positive thinking. They are saying, this bad thing does not have to happen. It's not inevitable. Right. And we don't want it to happen because we've read so many dystopias. So we would prefer to have, there's no perfect form of government. It just doesn't exist. There's not a form of government that pleases everyone, makes everybody happy so far that we know about. But there are betters and worses, and we would prefer better to worse. and what you are proposing is worse, Mr. King.
Absolutely. Speaking of being thinking positively and acting positively, these days we are in the process of establishing a center for PEN Israel, and I started working on the establishment of PEN Israel almost 2 years ago. However, the political context in which I started this initiative is radically different than what we are experiencing today in Israel. And I know that you were one of the founders of PEN Canada. Can you tell me a little about your involvement with PEN over the years?
Okay, so yes, in the 1980s, we in the 70s had been establishing things like the Writers Union of Canada, because before that time, we didn't have any agents in this country. We didn't have anybody who should tell us what ought to be in a book contract. People just didn't know. And the writers got together and put together the union. We shared information. We developed a minimum standard contract. It was very sort of union stuff. And it made no distinction amongst writers on the basis of their ideology or affiliation. It was just about the business end of writing. So what's a contract? What should be in it? What should you be looking for? Should secondhand bookstores be importing new copies of our books from the United States and selling them as remainders without paying the publisher or the writer, that kind of thing. And then we set up the Writers' Trust, which was more in aid of writers. So people who fell on hard times in the middle of a book could get a little grant, things like that. It went through some rough moments. We did have an executive director that we found was putting the bills to be paid under the carpet. We had to surmount those sorts of obstacles. But then once we had done that, we had an invitation. This is myself and Graham. We did all of these things together. An invitation, and there had been a PEN Center in Montreal, but it hadn't been outside Montreal. It had been bilingual. It had been more like a kind of a tea party, which I wasn't interested in that. So this was a moment in world history when we just gone through the Argentinian generals. We'd gone through some amnesty I'd been connected with before. I knew of these kinds of cases where people in democratic countries could work on behalf of other countries. And you know that PEN started as a kind of tea party. Let's get together and talk about writing, capital W. But then along came the 30s, fascism, and PEN got itself together and changed its direction and put its efforts into rescuing writers in danger that were in these countries. So it took that direction. And we were invited to, because the one in Montreal had decided to separate into English and French. It had been bilingual. Francophones wanted their own. Anglophones weren't numerous enough there to really do anything with an organization. So they asked me to do it. And I thought that they already had some kind of an organization. I was in England at the time. I got back to Canada and found out that no, they didn't. They didn't have any money. They didn't have a mailing list. They didn't know, they had actually nothing. Right. So we got together with an old writer friend called Eugene Benson, and we bought some postage stamps. It's before the internet. And we wrote letters to all of these writers across the country. And that's how it started, with no money. I then wrote a parody cookbook called the Can-Lit Food Book, in which we got pieces of writing about food arranged according to breakfast, coffee, lunch, tea, dinner, funerals, parties, cannibalism. We put them in this book. And then and I did the illustrations because they're cheaper. And then we got recipes from actual writers that we put in the back of the book. Problem is, some of them don't cook at all. So one of the recipes was for toast. In the toaster, push it down, it comes out, you put butter on it. One of them was for grapefruit. You cut the grapefruit in half. And one of them, it was a large frozen fish and a chainsaw. That's what you needed. So we put these recipes in, and we talked an agent into selling it without taking a commission. And we got enough money from that to actually hire an executive director. And that's how it began. And then we used to put on gala events at which writers would do silly things, some serious things, some silly things, and people would pay money to go to that. And it was one of those that Salman Rushdie made his first public appearance with a political figure. And we didn't even know he was coming. It was very hush-hush. So I had been singing a country and Western trio with words having to do with writing. And we were backstage taking off our outfits, and we were told, we're locking down the backstage. Salman Rushdie is here. He's coming on in Act 2, and you, Margaret, are going to introduce him. Okay. Like that. So that was 1989. And our emphasis in Penn Canada was in the Writers in Prison program, which didn't mean teaching Shakespeare in prisons. It meant writers who were in prisons in other countries for what they had written. So getting them out, calling attention to their cases. We won some, we lost some, and people would concentrate on their particular writers that they're working on. Other pens in other countries would concentrate on different writers. And Penn in the United States now is very active.
Right.
They've had to turn some of their attention to their own country. We usually were just working on behalf of other countries, but they've had to deal with the censorship and book banning that's been going on.
That's interesting. Margaret, you're on the border between being a writer and a public figure that is extremely private to being very active and involved intellectual. You speak frequently about climate change and the environment. How do you separate between Atwood the writer and Atwood the tweeter?
Well, the second is really just performing the functions of a citizen. Okay.
Interesting.
We could have a long talk about writing. What is writing? Should it have a moral dimension? It can't actually help but have a moral dimension. You can't avoid it. But duties as a citizen are actually not available to some citizens, because if they perform those duties publicly, they would get fired. If you work for a bank, you're not going to be out there waving around signs, most likely. So artistic figures, not confined to writers, but including singers and other types of people, frequently get asked to do these things because they are self-employed. Partly because they have what is called a platform, but
Right.
partly because they're self-employed and their real employers are the readers, who are numerous. So some of what they do may annoy some of their readers. And if it annoys all of them, basically they're out of a job. But they can't be fired by an organization. And if they are fairly far down the totem pole, they may not wish to do these things because it might influence their getting grants, something like that. But I don't get grants. So I do it partly because I can and other people can't. It's not my natural inclination. I'm not a natural activist. It's not my job.
Right.
It's a thing that you can do as a citizen because you can. But I can't do, of course, all of the things that I'm asked to do because they are extremely numerous.
And do you feel that Twitter or social media in general are still a safe space for
No, of
speaking?
course not. Never has been. There are no safe spaces.
Right.
It's an illusion.
Mhm.
Safe is an illusion. There's safer and less safe.
Right.
It's like governments, better and worse, but not perfect. So there is no safe. And every time you get in an automobile and go out on the road, you're risking your life, not because you're a bad driver, but because somebody else out there might be. You can't predict that. So safe, no. The real question is, I suppose, what about social media and how destabilizing has it been?
Right.
And the answer is every new form of human communication has been destabilizing. The ancient Greeks were worried about writing. There are a lot of objections to writing. You know, it's going to mean nobody will be able to memorize the epic poems anymore. We will just, our minds will just be vacant and we'll have to rely on this writing, which wasn't invented to do novels and poems. It was invented to do counting and stock keeping because we can memorize lots of things if they're made of words, particularly songs. They're stick in your head a lot. But you can't deal with numbers automatically over about 7. You've got to use some kind of counting device. So that was destabilizing. Money is a communication device, among other things. Very destabilizing. Printing press, Gutenberg, extremely destabilizing, led to all sorts of people reading the Bible, creation of sects, religious warfare, a lot of political pamphlets, a great deal of porn. We think of it as, oh, what a wonderful invention. It allows us to read War and Peace in a cheap edition. But there was a lot more, and you got then 300 years of religious warfare in Europe. A lot of dead people.
Yeah.
Next comes, what was next? I guess it would be the telegraph, and quite a bit has been written about that. If it hadn't been for the telegraph, would World War I ever have started? Because the reaction time became very small between an event and your reaction. You hardly had time to think about it. It's instant news. Newspapers, yellow journalism, need we mention that? The idea that newspapers are these noble institutions, et cetera, forget that. Go back and read the history. They weren't always. They should be supported now because we know where they live and who they are, and then at least you can sue them if they get too far out of line. But no human communication device has ever been wonderful and noble through and through. It just hasn't happened. Films, radio is very destabilizing because people thought with every new technology, you think it's, wow, this is the final authority. This is really it. And this is somebody talking right into my ear. They must be telling me the truth. But of course, immediately demagogues and hate mongers, et cetera, took over. Next was TV.
Right.
Marshall McLuhan, authority. Kennedy was TV presentable and Nixon wasn't. That's true enough. Then we got very hooked on that and we used to just watch it like mesmerized. But after a while, and then came the internet, and you know about that. And now there's big debates about, so Twitter, now owned by Elon Musk, how good is that? Yeah. And how much is he adhering to his own stated principles? Right. Not. He just banned something called the tweet of God.
Yeah, I just thought that you retweeted it.
God, he canceled God. I mean, come on. So TikTok, is it really a Chinese backdoor to spy on everybody? etc. and so forth. There's a satirical magazine called The Onion,
Yeah.
which they did an article some time ago saying, oh, they've just invented this great spy device for us. It's called Facebook. People are putting up everything about themselves. We know everything about them. We don't have to peer in their windows anymore because they are telling us. Oh yeah. So I think particularly for young people who can't remember a world without these things,
Right.
it becomes very consuming and can lead to a great deal of depression and anxiety because you think that world is real. It's not. It's a creation.
I have a few questions about feminism. You're considered to be one of the writers that heralded literary feminism in its sharpest manner. Do you see a backlash in regard to women's rights and feminism?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, but let us say at the beginning that there's 75 different kinds of feminism. There's not just one kind. So it's like it's one of those isms that you have to ask the person, what kind are we talking about? But in the general umbrella is women are human beings. They should have equal rights as citizens, and so on and so forth. So that's the umbrella. You could put pretty much all feminists under that umbrella, and then there are 75 denominations, some of which are less pleasant than others.
Right.
Has there been, however, a pushback against women's rights, particularly in the United States? So we know about Afghanistan, we know about Iran. They too are protesting. How will that end? I don't know. It's very hard to keep control of a government if 30% or more of the population is against you. And there seem to be a lot of people objecting to this extreme confinement of women and narrowing of their space, and the fixation on clothing really just, it goes back a long way.
Right.
It goes back to the Code of Hammurabi. There's laws about clothing there. So very old, very ancient world, particularly in societies in which most people couldn't read. You needed to be able to look at a person and tell what their status was. So a lot of the clothing things are about that. So is this a peasant? Is it an aristocrat? What's their status? I need to be able to tell that by what they're wearing. But it got very focused on women and covering them up. And who was writing those laws? Well, mostly men. In fact, they're all men. Why did I say mostly? Societies that are more matriarchal. I'm thinking of Africa. I'm thinking of traditional indigenous societies. Are also more equal in their approach to rights.
Interesting.
So if things are inherited through the mother, there is an assumption that the female half of the human race is important.
You wrote an article about abortion rights for The Atlantic, and when the magazine showed your piece on Twitter, they wrote, Margaret Atwood watching her fictional abortion dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale, become reality. And then you wrote back, it's not an abortion dystopia, it's a theocracy that affects everything, include who can read, not who can vote. They've abolished also divorce.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you meant?
Okay, if it were just about abortion, it would just be about abortion, but it's not just about abortion. It's about who controls the babies. That's one of the elements of the theocracy. And but it's a real theocracy in that it's a pyramid. There are people at the top. If you're a female at the top of the pyramid, you've got more rights than a man at the bottom. So that's what a pyramid is like. So reading the book, it didn't get that much into the television series, but the men in the book are told who to marry. So back to medieval times, essentially, particularly the way the aristocratic families of Europe were trading their kids. They would trade their kids at a fairly early age. My kid will marry your kid, and then we will have control of this piece of land, because it was all about land. So who's going to get the land? Anyway, in the Gilead theocracy, men are at the top, high status women are underneath them. They don't have the rights of the men at the top, but they have more rights than all of the people at the bottom. Like that. So I take it seriously. If you affect the rights of women, you affect everything else in the society. And states that are enacting these measures in the United States are going to find a lot of families moving out of them because they actually care about their daughters. They think this is going to increase the birth rate.
Right.
It doesn't usually. It increases the death rate.
Interesting.
So people bleed on the floor. I mean, one of the stupidest things that they have done in one of these states is a bill that would say girls in school cannot talk about their menstrual cycles. Where did that come from? What was in this guy's head? He wants it to be so that this doesn't exist. You're not supposed to mention it because it doesn't exist.
Right.
So very hard to understand the thinking. But I think it's a power move. I'm going to make your life so miserable that you will quit teaching in schools, because I don't like public education anyway, and I want the kids to be ignorant.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be the result. Who would want to be a teacher under those situations? It's right out of 1984, in which the children are tittle-tattling on the adults, as they did in Nazi Germany and as they did in the Cultural Revolution in China.
Interesting. Speaking of bleeding on the floor, you're an avid vegan and an animal lover.
Me?
Yeah.
No, I'm not a vegan.
Not a vegan?
No,
Oh.
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'm more like a fishitarian.
Vegetarian, okay.
Yeah, so I have to I think we should all pay attention to what we're eating and where it comes from, like that. But no, I do some vegan recipes.
Right. Not, I thought for some reason, because you talk a lot about it, I mean, like it's something that seems that it's close to your heart.
Well, it's close to my thinking, because we know where a lot of greenhouse gases are coming from, like that. So are we going to have to alter the way we live on the planet? And how are we going to alter it? Are we going to, it's a bit of a stretch. I've got chickens with no heads that grow multiple wings and breasts in the Oryx and Craig. Well, people are working on that. So people are thinking a lot about what are we going to eat? What is the cost of what we're going to eat? The cost in money, and also the cost in pollution. What are we actually doing when we are eating a given item? So I favor organic food, not because I think it's better for me or that I'm going to live longer, but because it doesn't kill everything else. It's not destructive of the biosphere. And yes, I know that it takes more acreage to grow it, but maybe that is worth it. Anyway, a lot of thinking is going on around these issues, and we cannot continue to take way more out of the planet than we're putting back. That's the end result. So I'm very interested in mushroom fabrics.
Mhm.
Mushrooms are going to be big. They're making a lot of things out of mushrooms now.
Fabric is-
I'm interested in growing fibers for clothing in algae vats. Neither of these involve animals, mass agriculture, pesticides, any of those things. And mushrooms can also dissolve plastics and clean up oil spills. So this is going to be a theme. Mushroom, a theme.
So
Yeah.
do you think that we are going towards some positive changes in regard to climate change, or?
We are. So there's a book coming out, I think in December, by a data person. It's coming out of England. I wish I'd had the name right here, but I just saw Galley.
Mhm.
I'll be doing a little introduction to this person's TED talk.
Mhm.
And she's got the data, what is the factual truth of some of these trends. And I was talking to another person recently who said, here's where we would be if we had done nothing.
Right.
Here's where we actually are.
Mhm.
So we know from the data that a number of the changes that people have been making have had an effect. And when we did our series called Practical Utopias this fall, we had one of these people on talking to us, and people said, what should we do? And he said, well, best thing you can do is to insulate your house. Yeah, that you personally can do
Right.
is make sure you're not just wasting a lot of energy in the form of heat and cold that doesn't have to happen. And some new inventions have come on that are going to be very positive if they're implemented,
Mhm.
including one having to do with air conditioning.
Mhm.
So air conditioning
Yes.
burns a lot of energy because it has to take the water out of the air before it cools it. So a lot of the energy goes into taking out the water. This new invention is a membrane that you put on that takes the water out before it gets cooled. And that cuts the cost and the emissions of the air conditioning by 80%. So that's huge. If all of the air conditioners had that, and a lot of them are these technological changes that affect just one thing. But then if you add them all up, it would be really quite a lot. So in Egypt, they're making building tiles out of recycled plastic bags,
Mhm.
which would otherwise go into the Mediterranean. So you have to make it so that there's a positive outcome to be had by doing that kind of thing. So I know a lot of people in this country, we have these things called decks.
Mhm.
The
Next.
thing
Okay.
made of wood outside your house that people sit out on in the summer. So traditionally they're made of wood, which rots.
Mhm.
Now they're making them out of recycled plastic
Oh.
planks. Don't rot, and their other positive is you don't have to paint them. The other positive is you don't get slivers in your bare feet from walking on them. So why would people not then switch over to that building material, which they will? You have to make it attractive enough, cheap enough, and carbon neutral or negative enough, which is not people's first consideration. It's usually cheap enough, durable enough. You have to make a better product that doesn't cost too much and is attractive. And many minds are busily engaged on these problems. So I'm cheered up by that.
That's good. I have
But this is not me as a writer. It's me as a citizen talking to you.
have a couple more questions. I'm curious, which books do you like to read today? Are you reading contemporary fiction at all?
I read everything, but in history, science, and fiction, but I never pick favorites
Mhm.
because the others hear about it and then they get annoyed.
Okay. How was COVID time for you? Did you get to to travel abroad with book
No.
promotion?
No, nobody went anywhere. So I divided into 3 eras:
Mhm.
early COVID,
Mhm.
middle COVID, and late COVID. And we're still sort of in late COVID. So early COVID, nobody knew anything. We were disinfecting our cabbages. We didn't know how these organisms were being transmitted. We were avoiding people on the street. We were walking around them like this. We were frowning at them if they were doing running, like you're emitting, you're breathing too much. We had that attitude. And of course, anybody who thought they were going to launch a book in spring of 2020 was really left out on a limb.
Mhm.
So there were some efforts made to try to support them, to try to support various television shows, to do Zooms with people. It was before Zoom had been mastered, so some of the Zooming was quite funny. My favorite was the man who got a cat filter stuck on his head. And then you have, various other favorites. The journalist who got photobombed by his small children, that was good. And these things just went around the globe through social media.
Mhm.
But then people mastered Twitter and we had fewer of those moments. So writers spend a lot of time alone anyway.
Mhm.
That was not such a problem. And some of my family came to live with me because they would have more space, and they had a 4-year-old. So that would be my grandson. And therefore we had a kind of weird college roommate situation, which we were taking turns cooking the meals, and then we were saying, "Who ate my thing?" I was saving that because we were planning the meals and getting the ingredients, and sometimes they would just disappear. Anyway, yeah, so we did that, and that was good. That went on for about 1.75 years.
Mhm.
So middle COVID, we knew more. And we were segueing into what kind of mask actually worked.
Mhm.
Early COVID, you saw a lot of handmade efforts, some of them very sparkly. They were ineffective, but they were attractive. Middle COVID, we knew what kind.
Mhm.
And we were almost on the verge of having a vaccine, so people were more hopeful. Middle to late COVID was the vaccine era,
Mhm.
and the invention of these things you did online in order to come and go from countries. They were very annoying, I have to say, but they kind of worked in a way. They sort of worked. Anyway, they made people feel that something was being done, I suppose.
Right.
And the virus itself morphed.
Mhm.
We knew more about it. It was more permissible to run on the street. We stopped disinfecting our cabbages. And I would say we are now in third era late COVID. There still is COVID, but it's much less lethal. You still don't want to get it
Right.
because you don't want to have long COVID at
Right.
all. But there seemed to be fewer serious cases. It's going the way of the 1919 influenza epidemic. We still have flu every year,
Yeah.
the descendant of that, but it's much less lethal, and you can get a shot for it. So I think we're going to be getting COVID shots, just like these other shots that you get, and that will probably narrow the spread.
Right.
Let us hope. That's where we are with COVID. What
Were you
did I do? What did I write? Yes, I wrote a lot, it seems. Yeah, a lot of them were short pieces
Mhm.
in response to cries for help.
Did you get the chance to talk with Israeli colleagues about the current situation in Israel now? Or
Which
not?
colleagues?
No,
What sort of
writers, or if you know, I don't know, friends or non-Israelis even, or I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I don't work for a university.
Mhm.
I don't have any colleagues.
Colleagues in the field,
I have people I know.
people you know.
Yeah,
People
people I know. People I know.
happen to be Israeli.
People I know are going, this is horrible.
Mhm.
But that would be people I know, wouldn't it? So I don't know everybody. I can't think that very many people think this is a positive development. Yeah, we don't need another authoritarian strongman in the world.
Absolutely not. I think we have enough.
Well, we have too many. We can do with none, but democracies, on the other hand, are going to have to look at themselves and ask themselves if they're actually becoming oligarchies ruled by nobody but rich people, at which point they're not democracies anymore. Unless you have some sharing of the wealth, you're just going to get a lot of rich people running things. You're going to have an oligarchy, and you're going to be right back in the Renaissance, essentially. So yes, they will have nice swimming pools and things, and then there will be a lot of peasants for whom they have no regard and don't care if a lot of them die. So is that a democracy that you wish to have? Right. Not me. It will be, people will be able to vote, but the numbers of people that they will be able to vote for will be determined by money and nothing else. And then you'll get the French Revolution. That wasn't fun. Things get too top heavy, the society collapses.
Yeah.
There isn't a society anymore. So you can have your gated communities full of rich people, and then you can have roving bands of warlords. It's not fun.
No, absolutely not. Hopefully, our protest will do some in changing what goes on here. Thank you so much, Margaret, and thank you to the Mishkenot She'ananim for hosting this talk. And I hope you will join us in the festival for all our other events this year.